All right. Welcome to the stream, everybody. Today is a very special day. It's also a sad day. It's sad because Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia, the co-instructor for the PMC Consciousness and Ideology course, has COVID. And so I'm doing an exegetical reading. What is an exegetical reading? Well, that's a fantastic question. It's where I read aloud and sometimes talk about it. In an audiobook, anybody can read it aloud as long as they have, the basic capacities for reading aloud. But an exegetical reading puts the reader in the hot seat and says, you're actually going to have to kind of unpack that, contextualize it, and explain it as you go sometimes. And so for me, it is a way of getting myself to do readings that I think I should be doing. What is the reading that I think I should be doing today? Well, everybody, I'm so excited that you get to find out. It is currently in the appendix of the, I think, main edition of The Souls of Black Folk. But it's actually an essay called The Talented Tenth. The Talented Tenth is a very important work of history, as is The Souls of Black Folk itself. I was having a conversation before we got set up here with somebody who said, okay, well, would you consider this to be like a really important book? Absolutely. And the question was, oh, so are we talking about W.E.B. Du Bois as a PMC? Is that what's going on? Like is PMC, is that like as like a condemnation? Like, is it negative, a negative assessment of the man? No, not at all. That is not what I am saying. It's a mixed bag, like all human beings. There's some good, there's bad. The thing I find most grating throughout this book is the way he uses the word class is interchangeable with group. Any group with a particular set of interests is a class. So black people, a class, right? Now, that'll be bothersome for almost anybody who wants to have a more rigorous sense for class. But the work itself, The Souls of Black Folk, one of the most important works of sociology ever written. Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the most sweeping and prolific and beautiful works of sociology and cultural studies ever written. Without any doubt, The Souls of Black Folk is something that you have to read if you want to do sociology. And it is something that you have to read if you want to do cultural studies. And it is something that you have to read if you want to talk about the experience of being black in the United States or black studies, which is obviously not my normal wheelhouse. People will say, get in your own lane, white boy. This is not your job to be teaching this text. Okay, some people would say that. Not a lot of people, but there's some people who would say that. And we could see where they're coming from, but I think they're wrong. And so I'm going to read it because I think it's important, because Theory Underground is primarily focused on the good life, introduction to philosophy, political and social theory, and then women philosophers and cultural studies. And cultural studies or special cultural topics, obviously black radicalism, racism, those are one of the main ones that you're going to have to work through at the university. But also, if you just are trying to understand society sociologically, anthropologically, economically, politically, philosophically, theoretically, well, then you're going to need a basis in some certain texts. There are like Durkheim and Weber and Habermas, these thinkers like Bourdieu and Foucault, who are not easily subsumable to anybody's ideological axes to grind, but who have made fundamental contributions to the history of thinking about society, whether they are, and I would throw Levi Strauss in there. I would throw Boas in there. Margaret Mead goes in there. There's a lot of these thinkers who you could put them over here on the anthropology side, you can put them over here on sociology side, but really what unites them all is that they are social theorists. But bringing it back around to the idea of the PMC, W.E.B. Du Bois is, well, somebody who I guess is very relevant to the PMC course, because instead of giving a lecture next week on Michael Lind's work, The New Class War, which I was going to do, I had decided to instead do a lecture on Dr. Adolph Reed Jr.'s work in Renewing Black Intellectual History. He has an essay. It's a collection of essays that are interventions on the field, critiquing typical liberal and progressive ways of interpreting history. And what Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. does is he contextualizes the souls of Black folk, he historicizes the souls of Black folk, and he shows how the people who are its biggest sort of celebrators today, who act like nothing's really changed, everything written about it then is just as applicable as to our situation now, are reading it through a presentist lens in a sort of trans-historical way that essentializes race in culture instead of biology, but does so in a way that is, he even says, supra-historical, meaning like there are ontological races outside of history that are fundamentally, distinct entities. We can't really ever nail down exactly what they are, but that kind of reasoning is the reasoning that Alexander Dugin uses. It's the reasoning of your standard ethno-nationalist thinkers. It's also a sort of product of what happens when you critique racist science, but all your focus was on how racism actually isn't really, or races aren't actually really scientific. Okay, so what if they're not actually scientific? What if they're not actually something that can be empirically validated and repeatedly demonstrated, and everybody can get behind the definitions that are being used in nature themselves? They're not. Well, so what if they're not in the DNA, in the biology, or that the biology and the DNA are not determinate factors, or like at least the most determinate factors? So what if at the same time all the rest of the thinking and approach concerning race still is operative? It's just been reduced now to culture instead of to biology. What's the difference if it's still functioning within capitalism the same way that it did when scientific racism was operable? Those are the kinds of questions Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. is raising. And there's a lot of very important stuff there in terms of PMC critique. And he's not just calling W.E.B. Du Bois a PMC or bad. He doesn't think that way. But it is important for us to historicize this text. But for today, because it is W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday tomorrow, so happy birthday to the ghost of W.E.B. Du Bois, and because this is a bonus stream done in the absence of Elton, who has COVID tonight, let's get into it. Let's read something that we wouldn't have read otherwise, right? How many people read Du Bois this year? Okay, in the chat, let me know if you actually did. Chances are not a lot of you, and that's okay. There's a lot of things to read, and we feel stressed out about all the things we have to read, and then we feel guilty about all the things that we aren't reading. And so part of the goal of Theory Underground is to demystify books, to take nonfiction off the shelf, so to speak, and to decharge it, to let out all that pressure that says you have to read this book from beginning to end. No, just listening to an hour of this stream will give you more Du Bois than you probably would have had in your life in 5 years. So that's okay. That's good. And I want you to get a sense for his voice. And so what is the talented 10th? What is this specific text that we want to read? Well, I'm going to do the Control F function here in Adobe Acrobat and go to the first time that it comes up in the introduction. I'm going to read that paragraph so that you all get a sense for why they put the talented 10th in here. Upon its publication in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk drew attention above all for its firm and careful reasoned criticism of Booker T. Washington, the former slave who had risen to unparalleled prominence and influence as the founder and director of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Chapter 3 of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others is a greatly expanded version of a short review of Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery, published by Du Bois in The Dial in July 1901 under the title The Evolution of Negro Leadership. This chapter, and to some degree the book as a whole, can be read as the first public statement of a class of Negroes who cannot agree with Mr. Washington, but who had previously been silent, in part out of fear at the unchallenged power of Washington's Tuskegee machine, easily the dominant force in black political life at the turn of the century. Du Bois called this class the talented 10th, the portion of the intellectual elite committed to the uplift of the black population through the pursuit of civil rights, the support for higher education, and the attainment of political power. He only employs the phrase once in The Souls of Black Folk, in the section called Of the Training of Black Men. But the book is very much the manifesto of the talented 10th, and thus an appropriate companion to the essay that Du Bois published the same year extolling the aristocracy of the race. It was recognized as such in its time. As Jessie Fawcett, the schoolteacher and future novelist, wrote in a grateful letter to Du Bois, "We have needed someone to voice the intricacies of the blind maze of thought and action along which the modern, educated, colored man or woman struggles." Right? So that should give you a little bit of a sense for why we're bringing in the talented 10th, because obviously this is Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois is writing and living at the time of the betrayal of Reconstruction after the emancipation of slaves in the United States. This is a very gruesome and difficult time to be alive as a black person in the United States, more so than maybe any other time, at least according to W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois actually, in The Souls of Black Folk, is saying, in some ways things were better under slavery. There are ways that the betrayal of Reconstruction is more brutal to us, right? And it's that kind of, as a serf, at least you had, the land that you were considered to be a part of. You paid your share to the church and to the feudal lord, and they left you alone. Now, obviously, it's not the best comparison ever, but Du Bois says, yeah, in some cases there were nice masters, but what we have now is abject poverty, sharecroppers who are essentially still serving the same function as slaves, and a society that is like, well, what's your problem? You were freed. You should be doing great by now. What's wrong with you? Which is why the Democrats and Republicans were looking to Booker T. Washington to be this sort of voice for black people, because they were like, well, this guy over here with his Tuskegee mission, he gets it, because the Tuskegee mission was basically like a business school for black people. It wasn't just teaching business, but that was the idea, is to make you into a responsible citizen who would be able to become a good bourgeois subjectivity. Okay. The last thing I would say before we get into the Talented Tenth is that The Souls of Black Folk and the Talented Tenth, published around the same time, comes out the other side of some fire-ass research on the part of W.E.B. Du Bois. He went out to the South and he just interviewed and interviewed and interviewed thousands and thousands of black farmers. Let me see if I can actually find the exact section here. No. Well, I'm not gonna pull it up. Just you don't have to take my word for it. He conducted thousands of interviews, and this is one of the first real works of sociology where it comes out the other side of that kind of commitment to actually hearing from people on the ground, what is your experience like? And so, it's definitely something that listening to while working at Amazon, I found to be moving, eye-opening, and probably, I would say, one of the most important things that not only if you are doing social science, but just if you are doing American history in high school, you really ought to read this book. And I hope that they assign it, and I hope that conservatives who are against talking about slavery or racism do not get in the way of that. At the same time, we cannot understand W.E.B. Du Bois without thinking about progressivism as a response to working class struggles and as a way of trying to create conciliation between the ruling and working classes. Okay? This is almost something that he was eager to become a representative of at the time. He's very much one of the kinds of progressives that we were talking about in the first and second week's lectures. And so I think that it's important to think about it that way, but no, it's not all bad in the sense that, oh, this could be thought of as a elitist. He's talking about a racial aristocracy. Yeah, but it's good intentioned. You can see why he's doing it, and his voice comes through. So without doing any more of a defense of it, let's get to that part. And I'll get the screen on, and you'll all be able to follow along with me if you want to. But if you don't want to follow along with me, you can just play video games or wash dishes or whatever the hell it is that you want to do, because multitasking is everybody's favorite guilty pleasure in this day and age. Looks like nobody's in the live chat. What's going on? Am I getting shadow banned off of YouTube right now? What's going on? Is it really that bad of a resolution on the YouTube side? Let me double check. Looking at the inside of my YouTube live studio, it looks like the worst resolution ever. I used the auto configuration wizard on OBS to make sure that it would be as fast as possible. Yeah, that should be fine. All right, we're good enough. We're good enough to go. Let's get to it. Also, I've got a couple people here on the live side of a Zoom call. We'll have a little bit of a discussion afterwards, or maybe at points along the way. You're all free to interject and raise questions in the chat. Let's get to it. Appendix 2, The Talented Tenth. Du Bois contributed The Talented Tenth to the 1903 anthology The Negro Problem, a series of articles by representative American Negroes of today. Zoom in here, see if I can make this larger. That's better. It amplifies some of the concerns expressed in The Souls of Black Folk regarding the higher education and social responsibilities of the black aristocracy of talent and character. Let's begin. The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best, with an uppercase B, of this race, that they may guide the mass, with an uppercase M, away from the contamination and death of the worst, with an uppercase W, in their own and other races. Okay? I'll reread that without saying uppercase, lowercase, whatever. It is the problem of developing the best of this race that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. Now, the training of men is a difficult and intricate task. Its technique is a matter for educational experts, but its object is for the vision of seers. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of the schools: intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of that higher education which must underlie true life. On this foundation, we may build bread-winning, skill of hand, and quickness of brain, with never a fear lest the child and man mistake the means of living for the object of life. Sounds kind of like Karl Jaspers, except obviously he's not talking about races as groups or anything like that, but this idea that the role of higher education is not so that you can get a job, but so that you can become a full person who is then able to get a job. So like the full person aspect is the end, and the profession should be seen as the means. If this be true, and who can deny it, 3 tasks lay before me. First, to show from the past that the talented tenth, as they have risen among American Negroes, have been worthy of leadership. Secondly, to show how these men may be educated and developed. And thirdly, to show their relation to the Negro problem. That's a very important way of framing and proceeding with this controversial piece, right? The reason I consider that important is because obviously he's writing at a time when there's a lot of brutally racist stereotyping going on in the popular press, where people say, let's point at the worst of the worst of the worst, the things that nobody would want to have be representative of a group, and characterize the entire group in that way. And part of that led people to the conclusion, oh, not fit for leadership. And so obviously Du Bois has to show, no, actually American Negroes have been and are capable of leadership. And then he has to show that that didn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just happen by freeing somebody and saying, hey, you're formally free, on with your life. No. The kind of qualified life that comes out the other side of higher education comes out of a person who's cultivated their life of the mind, has to come out through a process of education and development. That'll be his second argument. And then his third argument is to show their relation to the Negro problem. Next section. You misjudge us because you do not know us. From the very first, it has been the educated and intelligent of the Negro people that have led and elevated the masses, and the sole obstacles that nullified and retarded their efforts were slavery and race prejudice. For what is slavery but the legalized survival of the unfit and the nullification of the work of natural internal leadership? Negro leadership, therefore, sought from the first to rid the race of this awful incubus, that it might make way for natural selection and the survival of the fittest. And, okay. So that's one of the things, obviously, that he catches some flack for here. I don't want to have to get too in the weeds here, but he says, yeah, Negro leadership, therefore, sought from the first to rid the race of this awful incubus, that it might make way for natural selection and the survival of the fittest. This idea of social Darwinism is very strong here. In colonial days came Phyllis Wheatley and Paul Coofe striving against the bars of prejudice, and Benjamin Banneker, the almanac maker, voiced their longings when he said to Thomas Jefferson, I freely and cheerfully acknowledge that I am of the African race, and in color, which is natural to them, of the deepest dye. And it is under a sense of the most profound gratitude to the supreme ruler of the universe that I now confess to you that I am not under that state of tyrannical thraldom and inhuman captivity to which too many of my brethren are doomed, but that I have abundantly tasted the fruition of those blessings which proceed from the free and unequaled liberty with which you are favored, and which I hope you will willingly allow, you have mercifully received from the immediate hand of the Being from whom proceedeth every good and perfect gift. Being in this case was uppercase B, being signifying God or some deity. I don't know. Suffer me to, quote, suffer me to recall to your mind that time in which the arms of the British crown were, I think this is the continuation of the same quote on a new paragraph. And I think this paragraph goes on for 2 more paragraphs. So let's go. So that was all just kind of his introduction to Thomas Jefferson, right? And now he continues. Suffer me to recall to your mind that time in which the arms of the British crown were exerted with every powerful effort in order to reduce you to a state of servitude. Look back, I entreat you, on the variety of dangers to which you were exposed. Reflect on that period in which every human aid appeared unavailable, and in which every hope and fortitude wore the aspect of inability to the conflict, and you cannot but be led to a serious and grateful sense of your miraculous and providential preservation. You cannot but acknowledge that the present freedom and tranquility which you enjoy, you have mercifully received, and that a peculiar blessing of heaven. This, sir, was a time when you clearly saw into the injustice of a state of slavery, and in which you had just apprehensions of the horrors of its condition. It was then that your abhorrence thereof was so excited that you publicly held forth this true and invaluable doctrine, which is worthy to be recorded and remembered in all succeeding ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. End quote. I think the context for that is that Thomas Jefferson had been loudly against slavery and had intended to free slaves and talked about doing that when he got radicalized when he went to France around the time of the French Revolution. And so he, there was this sort of more radical version of Thomas Jefferson that came back to the United States and then kind of leaned into the comfort that his plantation was providing him, and he seems to have betrayed that original impulse, right? And so basically, this is a very elegantly worded and, carefully respectful call-out post, essentially, coming from Benjamin Banneker, the almanac maker. Then came Dr. James Durham, who could tell even the learned Dr. Rush something of medicine, and Lemuel Haynes, to whom Middlebury College gave an honorary A.M. in 1804. These and others we may call the Revolutionary Group of Distinguished Negroes. They were persons of marked ability, leaders of a talented tenth, standing conspicuously among the best of their time. They strove by word and deed to save the color line from becoming the line between the bond and free, but all they could do was nullified by Ellie Whitney and the curse of gold, so they passed into forgetfulness. I'm going to paste that into the chat and ask Anne or Nance, since you're both there in the Zoom side, if you get a chance, find out for me, if you can, what this reference is. But it sounds like somebody, this Eli Whitney, was some kind of a sellout, for lack of a better word, probably a sort of traitor of the cause. I just don't really know, but it sounds like greed or something was involved. So because of this Eli Whitney guy, these other important black early intellectuals are ones that got forgotten about, according to Du Bois. But their spirit did not wholly die. Here and there in the early part of the century came other exceptional men. Some were natural sons of unnatural fathers and were given often a liberal training, and thus a race of educated mulattoes sprang up to plead for black men's rights. There was Ira Aldridge, whom all Europe loved to honor. There was the voice, crying in the wilderness, David Walker, and saying, here's a nice long quote, "I declare it does appear to me as though some nations think God is asleep, or that he made the Africans for nothing else but to dig their mines and work their farms, or they cannot believe history, sacred or profane. I ask every man who has a heart and is blessed with the privilege of believing, is not God a God of justice to all his creatures? Do you say he is? Then if he gives peace and tranquility to tyrants and permits them to keep our fathers, our mothers, ourselves, and our children in eternal ignorance and wretchedness to support them and their families, would he be to us a God of justice? I ask, O ye Christians, who hold us and our children in the most abject ignorance and degradation that ever a people were afflicted with since the world began, I say, if God gives you peace and tranquility, and suffers you thus to go on afflicting us and our children, who have never given you the least provocation, would he be to us a God of justice? If you will allow that we are men who feel for each other, does not the blood of our fathers and of us, their children, cry aloud to the Lord of Sabaoth against you for the cruelties and murders with which you have and do continue to afflict us?" End quote. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Okay. Thank you, Anne. So that's why he was a sellout. This was the wild voice that first aroused Southern legislators in 1829 to the terrors of abolitionism. In 1831, there met that first Negro Convention in Philadelphia, at which the world gaped curiously, but which bravely attacked the problems of race and slavery, crying out against persecution and declaring that laws, as cruel in themselves as they were unconstitutional and unjust, have in many places been enacted against our poor, unfriended, and unoffending brethren, without a shadow of provocation on our part, at whose bare recital the very savage draws himself up for fear of contagion, looks noble and prides himself because he bears not the name of Christian." End quote. Side by side, this free Negro movement and the movement for abolition strove until they merged into one strong stream. Too little notice has been taken of the work which the talented 10th among Negroes took in the great abolition crusade. From the very day that a Philadelphia colored man became the first subscriber to Garrison's Liberator, to the day when Negro soldiers made the Emancipation Proclamation possible, black leaders worked shoulder to shoulder with white men in a movement, the success of which would have been impossible without them. There was Purvis and Remond, Pennington and Highland Garnet, Sojourner Truth and Alexander Crummell, and above all, Frederick Douglass. What would the abolition movement have been without them? They stood as living examples of the possibilities of the Negro race. Their own hard experiences and well-wrought culture said silently more than all the drawn periods of orators. They were the men who had made American slavery impossible. As Maria Weston Chapman once said, from the school of anti-slavery agitation, quote, "a throng of authors, editors, lawyers, orators, and accomplished gentlemen of color have taken their degree. It has equally implemented hopes and aspirations, noble thoughts and sublime purposes in the hearts of both races. It has prepared the white man for the freedom of the black man, and it has made the black man scorn the thought of enslavement, as does the white man, as far as its influence has extended. Strengthen that noble influence. Before its organization, the country only saw here and there in slavery some faithful Cudjoe or Dinah, whose strong natures blossomed even in bondage, like a fine plant beneath a heavy stone. Now, under the elevating and cherishing influence of the American anti-slavery society, the colored race, like the white, furnishes Corinthian capitals for the noblest temples. End quote. Where were these black abolitionists trained? Some, like Frederick Douglass, were self-trained, but yet trained liberally. And by the way that Frederick Douglass was self-trained is totally amazing. Basically, I think if I remember right, he had a really, really shitty master, and then he gets sold later to somebody who was a little bit more liberal with him, allowed him kind of to go do errands within the city and stuff like that. And so here he was running along doing errands in the city, and he started tracing letters and writing them down, but he didn't know what sounds they made, and he couldn't string them together into words. And he noticed some other boy who could read, and he started, I think, stealing food or things like that from his master, and then exchanging it to the boys in the neighborhood, I think, and then they would basically tutor him, but it was all self-driven in the sense that he was already trying before he found people to help him, and then he had to pay them, and so it was that's hardcore. Others, like Alexander Crummell and McCune Smith, graduated from famous foreign universities. Most of them rose up through the colored schools of New York and Philadelphia and Boston, taught by college-bred men like Russwurm and Dartmouth, and college-bred white men like New and Benezet. After emancipation came a new group of educated and gifted leaders: Langston, Bruce, and Eliot, Greener, Williams, and Payne. Through political organization, historical and polemic writing, and moral regeneration, these men strove to uplift their people. It is the fashion of today to sneer at them and to say that with freedom, Negro leadership should have begun at the plow and not in the Senate. A foolish and mischievous lie. 250 years the black serf toiled at the plow, and yet that toiling was in vain till the Senate passed the war amendments. And 250 years more, the half-free serf of today may toil at his plow, but unless he have political rights and righteously guarded civic status, he will still remain the poverty-stricken and ignorant plaything of rascals that he now is. This all sane men know, even if they dare not say it. This is ultimately a call for education, right? It's not just a call for the best and brightest to be sent off to college and then to become the representatives of the race, which there's a little bit of that will come through as we go. But this is also, in part, an argument that structural stultification of your life, of your mind, of the life of the mind, structural stultification meaning the structure stultifies your very possibilities for growth, that your capacities get left and nothing comes of them, right? Because we need to be cultivated. We need to be challenged, right? We cannot just work our entire lives without being debased, right? It's an injustice when a person has talents that go uncultivated, when a person has a calling that cannot be pursued. Let me pull up the actual definition of stultify. Cause to lose enthusiasm and initiative, especially as a result of tedious or restrictive routine. Structural stultification. I love that because it affects you, not just how you feel in immediacy, but more importantly, over your entire life, all of your latent capacities and talents that go uncultivated, unexercised, atrophy. And we have like this strong spirit. It's this human urge and impulse to do things, to create, to learn, to grow, and to make things better, and we're not able to. And so instead we feel inferior, and we feel exhausted, and we feel stupid. And of course we have drive still, and so we act out in all kinds of ways that we regret, but we don't have the concepts or tools or community to be able to get critical distance from ourselves. And so we feel wretched, right? And so this is the debasement that was obviously systematically being acted out upon or done to Black people in America. And it's what he was so concerned with. But also, I just want to say, this is the function of poverty, right? And so we look at crime, and we look at filth, and we look at domestic abuse, and we look at alcoholism and drug addiction and all of these things and think, oh, terrible. That's just terrible. What a terrible life to have to live. And we don't, and the tendency is, I mean, obviously, I was going to say we don't think about structural stultification. Obviously, we do. This is Theory Underground. But it's too easy to take what you see out of context and to think, and it's to fail to think, there but for the grace of God go I, or there but for the natural lottery that played out to my advantage go I. Coming from a poor, backwards part of this country, where people do live in filth and squalor, and screaming at children is irregular, beating children is irregular, alcoholism is a norm. Like, yeah, this is poverty. But how much more so of an insult to your higher aspirations would it be when this is being systematically done to you? And then how much more of an insult would it be if you are a genius of an intellect who has gone to multiple higher education establishments, including Humboldt University, as W.E.B. Du Bois did. We saw his alumni portrait at Humboldt University when we were in Berlin. I say we because Anna's in the chat, and the two of us were there a few months ago. But how much more of an insult to that nobility that you've cultivated when people are going to constantly treat you as reducible to what he would call the worst of our race, right? So this is his experience, this is his struggle, this is what he's dealing with, and this is a rallying call for education at the end of the day. By the way, welcome, Vivalita Godfrey. You look very red. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for letting me know I look very red. I have to have some kind of a light on me, and this is the best I can do. Sorry, only here to say nothing spectacular, but I am very much listening. Appreciate it. Thank you for dropping in. And so we come to the present, a day of cowardice and vacillation, of strident, wide-voiced, wrong and faint-hearted compromise, of double-faced dallying with truth and right, who are today guiding the work of the Negro people. The exceptions, of course. And yet, so sure as this talented tenth is pointed out, the blind worshippers of the average cry out in alarm, "These are exceptions! Look here at death, disease, and crime. These are the happy rule." Of course they are the rule, because a silly nation made them the rule. Because for 3 long centuries this people lynched Negroes who dared to be brave, raped black women who dared to be virtuous, crushed dark-hued youth who dared to be ambitious, and encouraged and made to flourish servility and lewdness and apathy. But now even this was able to crush all manhood, but not even this was able to crush all manhood and chastity and aspiration from black folk. A saving remnant continually survives and persists, continually aspires, continually shows itself in thrift and ability and character. Exceptional it is, to be sure, but this is the chiefest promise. It shows the capability of Negro blood, the promise of black men. Do Americans ever stop to reflect that there are in this land 1 million men of Negro blood, well-educated, owners of homes, against the honor of whose womanhood no breath was ever raised, whose men occupy positions of trust and usefulness, and who, judged by any standard, have reached the full measure of the best type of modern European culture? Is it fair, is it decent, is it Christian to ignore these facts of the Negro problem, to belittle such aspiration, to nullify such leadership, and seek to crush these people back into the mass out of which by toil and travail they and their fathers have raised themselves? Can the masses of the Negro people be in any possible way more quickly raised than by the effort and example of this aristocracy of talent and character? Was there ever a nation on God's fair earth civilized from downward that culture filled? I have to reread that sentence because it's a powerful one, and the whole cadence was off. He says, never. It is, ever was, and ever will be, from the top downward, that culture filters. The talented tenth rises and pulls all that are worth saving up to their vantage ground. This is the history of human progress, and the two historic mistakes which have hindered that progress were the thinking first that no more could ever rise save the few already risen, or second, that it would better the unrisen to pull the risen down. Okay, that is two very confusing ways of saying those two very important points. So I'm going to try to find another way to say that. He's saying that the talented raising up the general level is the history of human progress. And the two historic mistakes that have hindered that progress are thinking that the only ones who are capable of rising in intellect and, as full humans or whatever he's saying, the only ones who are capable of rising are the ones who've already risen. Right? It's a fallacy. You're taking what is for granted. And on the second, that it would better the unrisen to pull the risen down. Right? That would be one of the biggest inhibitors of progress, he is saying, is leveling. Is people who are average, saying people who want to read great works of philosophy and study science and mathematics and write books and try to encompass the whole and think through the contradictions of this life. Those people need to shut the fuck up and shorten what they say to make it simpler for everyone else, not to give people access to this higher plane, but no, fuck the higher plane. Bring yourself down to the level of everyone else and stay down. That is the sort of anti-verticality approach. The book by Peter Sloterdijk, You Must Change Your Life, is like a 800-page defense of verticality and an attack against this assumption that anything vertical must be bad, that anywhere where there is excellence, it must be on the basis of exploitation or it must be elitism. Obviously, the two can go hand in hand, but that's not necessary. How then shall the leaders of a struggling people be trained and the hands of the risen few strengthened? There can be but one answer. The best and most capable of their youth must be schooled in the colleges and universities of the land. We will not quarrel as to just what the University of the Negro should teach or how it should teach it. I willingly admit that each soul and each race soul needs its own peculiar curriculum. But this is, so he's saying that different race souls might need different curriculums. Another way of saying that is that people from different cultures might need different curriculums. Like the idea of a race soul is a little like, whoa, bro. But you know what he's saying. He's talking about soul as not like this, spiritual essence thing, so much as that part of the human that can be cultivated, that has latent talents, that has the desire for something beyond consumption, right? But this is true. A university is a human invention for the transmission of knowledge and culture from generation to generation through the training of quick minds and pure hearts, and for this work, no other human invention will suffice, not even trade and industrial schools. All men cannot go to college, but some men must. Every isolated group or nation must have its yeast, must have for the talented few centers of training where men are not so mystified and befuddled by the hard and necessary toil of earning a living, as to have no aims higher than their bellies, and no God greater than gold. This is true training, and thus in the beginning were the favored sons of the freedom trained. Out of the colleges of the north came, after the blood of war, Ware, Craveth, Chase, Andrews, Bumstead, and Spence, to build the foundations of knowledge and civilization in the Black South. Where ought they to have begun to build? At the bottom, of course, quibbles the mole with his eyes in the earth. Aye, truly, at the bottom, at the very bottom, at the bottom of knowledge, down in the very depths of knowledge, there where the roots of justice strike into the lowest soil of truth. And so they did begin. They founded colleges, and up from the colleges shot normal schools, and out from the normal schools went teachers, and around the normal teachers clustered other teachers to teach the public schools. The college trained in Greek and Latin and mathematics 2,000 men, and these men trained full 50,000 others in morals and manners, and they in turn taught thrift and the alphabet to 9 million of men, who today hold $300 million worth of property. It was a miracle, the most wonderful peace battle of the 19th century, and yet today men smile at it, and in fine superiority tell us that it was all a strange mistake, that a proper way to found a system of education is first to gather the children and buy them spelling books and hoes. Afterward, men may look about for teachers, if haply they may find them. Or again, they would teach men work. But as for life, why, what has work to do with life, they ask vacantly. Was the work of these college founders successful? Did it stand the test of time? Did the college graduates, with all their fine theories of life, really live? Are they useful men helping to civilize and elevate their less fortunate fellows? Let us see. Omitting all institutions which have not actually graduated students from a college course, there are today in the United States 34 institutions giving something above high school training to Negroes and designed especially for this race. 3 of these were established in border states before the war. 13 were planted by the Freedmen's Bureau in the years 1864 to 1869. 9 were established between 1870 and 1880 by various church bodies. 5 were established after 1881 by Negro churches, and 4 are state institutions supported by United States agricultural funds. In most cases, the college departments are small adjuncts to high and common school work. As a matter of fact, 6 institutions, Atlanta, Fisk, Howard, Shaw, Wilberforce, and Leland, are the important Negro colleges so far as actual work and number of students are concerned. In all these institutions, 750 Negro college students are enrolled. In grade, the best of these colleges are about a year behind the smaller New England colleges, and a typical curriculum is that of Atlanta University. Here, students from the grammar grades, after a 3 years high school course, take a college course in 136 weeks. 1/4 of this time is given to Latin and Greek. 1/5 to English and modern languages, 1/6 to history and social science, 1/7 to natural science, 1/8 to mathematics, and 1/8 to philosophy and pedagogy. In addition to these students in the South, Negroes have attended northern colleges for many years. As early as 1826, one graduated from Bowdoin College, and from that time till today, nearly every year has seen elsewhere other such graduates. They have, of course, met much color prejudice. 50 years ago, very few colleges would admit them at all. Even today, no Negro has ever been admitted to Princeton, and at some other leading institutions they are rather endured than encouraged. Oberlin was the great pioneer in the work of blotting out the color line in colleges, and has more Negro graduates by far than any other northern college. The total number of Negro college graduates up to 1899, several of the graduates of that year not being reported, was as follows. So, let's see how to read this table. Before 76, there were 137 Negro colleges as opposed to 75 white colleges? That doesn't make any sense. Wait, what? The total number of Negro college graduates up to 1899, several of the graduates of that year not being reported, was as follows. Oh, that's the number not of Negro colleges, but of graduates from Negro colleges. So before 76, 137, and from white colleges, 75. So that means 75 black graduates from white colleges and 137 black graduates from Negro colleges. That's how to read this table. Okay, so the numbers go up. So basically, I'll just read it down the line. So Negro colleges graduating graduates 137, and then in the next period of time 143, and then the next, and these are like 5-year chunks of time. So it goes from 137, 143, 250, 413, 600, 465, 475. Okay, so it just goes up until we're talking about 1899. So every 5 years, it's going up significantly. And on the other side, from white colleges, it goes from 75 to 22 to 31 to 43 to 66 to 88 to 64. Up and down, up and down, up and down, it looks like. Of these graduates, 2,079 were men and 252 were women. 50% of northern-born college men come south to work among the masses of their people at a sacrifice which few people realize. Nearly 90% of the southern-born graduates nearly 90% of the southern-born graduates, instead of seeking the personal freedom and broader intellectual atmosphere which their training has led them, in some degree, to conceive, stay and labor and wait in the midst of their black neighbors and relatives. One of the stories in The Souls of Black Folk is about a black man who went to college, and then he came back and was completely out of his element, and it was very hard to be there, and then he had to deal with racism, and the whole story is like super tragic. It ends in a very depressing way, and I'm not going to get too into it, but basically he devotes a big section of this book to just giving one example of what it's like. And it's hard enough just for any working class schmuck to go to college and then go back to your hometown, right? How much more so when everything is supercharged by racial tensions, right? During a time of segregation. My God. The most interesting question, and in many respects the crucial question to be asked concerning college-bred Negroes is, do they earn a living? It has been intimated more and once that the higher training of Negroes has resulted in sending into the world of work men who could find nothing to do suitable to their talents. Now and then there comes a rumor of a colored college man working at menial service, etc. Fortunately, returns as to occupations of college-bred Negroes gathered by the Atlanta Conference are quite full, nearly 60% of the total number of graduates. This enables us to reach fairly certain conclusions as to the occupations of the college-bred Negroes. Of 1,312 persons reported, there were, now here we have a table, 53.4% were teachers, 16.8% were clergymen or pastors, 6.3% were physicians, 5.6 students, 4.7 lawyers, 4.0 in government service, 3.6 in business, 2.7 farmers and artisans, 2.4 editors, secretaries and clerks, 0.5 miscellaneous. Over half are teachers. A sixth are preachers, another sixth are students and professional men, over 6% are farmers, artisans, and merchants, and 4% are in government service. In detail, the occupations are as follows. We've got another table. Do I have to read the goddamn tables? Occupations of college-bred men. Teachers. Presidents and deans, 19. Teachers of music, 7. Professors, principals, and teachers, 675. The total of all of these teachers is 701. Clergymen breaks down into bishop, chaplains in the U.S. Army, missionaries, presiding elders, preachers. Most of them are preachers. And this goes down. I'm gonna speed run this table by just saying, he breaks down physicians into doctors of medicine, druggists, dentists. The overwhelming majority were doctors of medicine, not druggists or dentists. Students, 74, lawyers, 62. Civil service breaks down into the U.S. ministry, plenipotentiary, U.S. consul, deputy collector, gauger, I don't know how to say that, postmasters, clerks, state civil service, city civil service. Most of them were clerks. The overwhelming majority were clerks. Businessmen, merchants, managers, real estate dealers. 30 were merchants, whereas 13 were managers. And then we got farmers, 26, clerks and secretaries. So, okay, anyway, you get the idea. These figures illustrate vividly the function of the college-bred Negro. He is, as he ought to be, the group leader, the man who sets the ideals of the community where he lives, directs its thoughts, and heads its social movements. It need hardly be argued that the Negro people need social leadership more than most groups, that they have no traditions to fall back upon, no long-established customs, no strong family ties, no well-defined social classes. All these things must be slowly and painfully evolved. The preacher was, even before the war, the group leader of the Negroes, and the church their greatest social institution. Naturally, this preacher was ignorant and often immoral, and the problem of replacing the older type by better educated men has been a difficult one. Both by direct work and by direct influence on other preachers and on congregations, the college-bred preacher has an opportunity for reformatory work and moral inspiration, the value of which cannot be overestimated. It has, however, been in the furnishing of teachers that the Negro College has found its peculiar function. Few persons realize how vast a work, how mighty a revolution has been thus accomplished. To furnish 5 millions and more of ignorant people with teachers of their own race and blood in one generation was not only a very difficult undertaking, but a very important one, in that it placed before the eyes of almost every Negro child an attainable ideal. It brought the masses of the blacks in contact with modern civilization, made black men the leaders of their communities and trainers of the new generation. In this work, college-bred Negroes were first teachers and then teachers of teachers. And here it is that the broad culture of college work has been of peculiar value. Knowledge of life and its wider meaning has been the point of the Negro's deepest ignorance, and the sending out of teachers whose training has not been simply for breadwinning, but also for human culture, has been of inestimable value in the training of these men. How's it going, everybody? I see that we've got more people who've joined live, so I wanted to acknowledge your existence over there. Hello, everybody, and also to Ann and Nance who are in the live chat. I hope everybody is not bored out of their minds and is even learning something. As I was saying at the beginning of the stream, this is not something that you probably read in the last year or 5 or even in high school. I mean, Anne had a very privileged high school education, and she was just telling me that she doesn't remember reading any nonfiction in high school, right? It's crazy that you have all these arguments over critical race theory today, but even in a progressive high school, they're not reading The Souls of Black Folk. I'm sorry. This is all very readable. It's very legible. This is not like insanely technical. So it just blows my mind that this is not something everyone reads, right? People are like, do the work. And then they're like reading Kimber Mex Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. Cringe. Come on. We've got W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, he hasn't gone anywhere. He's only more and more alive. I mean, of course, we have to keep him alive. And part of keeping him alive is not falsely comparing him to our present times, but also contrasting him, which is what Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. is trying to do in his essay that I do a reading of as well. But no, the point is you don't just compare, but you also contrast. And we have to historicize and make sense of what it has been and now is to be American, much less to be a Black American, much less to be a working class American, much less to be someone who comes from the bottom and goes to college or becomes, after being a dropout and a GED graduate, say, an autodidact in theory. Whatever it is, whatever your path to this kind of content is, insofar as you are developing yourself, insofar as you're developing your life of the mind, and you want to think about society. W.E.B. Du Bois is not just a historian. He is one of the most important social theorists or sociologists from those times. And in a lot of ways, he sets a lot of precedents. And he also establishes a lot of this sort of ways of thinking that are uncritically taken for granted nowadays. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. And that's for you as a thinker to make sense of for yourself, not just for me to tell you every which way we do or do not think this is good or bad or whatever. Ultimately, this is something you should read and sit with. But I'm glad that you are, out of the million things that you could be doing tonight, tuning in for this and allowing a little bit of it to seep into that very competitive region in your mind where you've got all these other kinds of priorities and all these other kinds of distractions and lots of dumb ideas as well, all mixed up. And we're injecting into that some good history, some good social theory, and a very important work. So thank you for being a part of that. I just wanted to give you this little pep talk to tell you you're doing a good job being here. It matters, you know? It matters to inject into your life of the mind a little cultivated thought from time to time. So thank you for joining me. If you weren't joining me in doing this, if I was literally all alone right now, I think that I would be doing something else. And it would be less fulfilling, less important, and more stultifying. So thank you for helping me do this. Andrew Parsons says, got introduced through Cornel West to Du Bois. Yes, West is a big deal in this world. And then Nance says, it strikes me that there is a lot of foreshadowing here, and it seems like a lot of this is still being rehashed. True. In earlier years, the two occupations of preacher and teacher were practically the ones only open to the black college graduate. Of later years, a larger diversity of life among his people has opened new avenues of employment. Nor have these college men made paupers and spendthrifts. 557 college-bred Negroes owned in 1899 $1,342,862,050 worth of real estate, assessed value, or $2,411 per family, which back then was a lot more than it is now, obviously. The real value of the total accumulations of the whole group is perhaps about $10 million or $5,000 apiece. Pitiful, is it not, besides the fortunes of oil kings and steel trusts, but after all, is the fortune of the millionaire the only stamp of true and successful living? Alas, it is with many, and there's the rub. As in, yeah, some people do think that's the only measure of success. That's stupid. That's what he's saying there. The problem of training the Negro is today immensely complicated by the fact that the whole question of the efficiency and appropriateness of our present system of education for any kind of child is a matter of active debate, in which final settlement seems still afar off. Consequently, it often happens that persons arguing for or against certain systems of education for Negroes have these controversies in mind and miss the real question at issue. What's that, Andrea? The main question, so far as the Southern Negro is concerned, is what, under the present circumstances, must the system of education do in order to raise the Negro as quickly as possible in the scale of civilization? The answer to this question seems to be clear. It must strengthen the Negro's character, increase his knowledge, and teach him to earn a living. Now it goes without saying that it is hard to do all these things simultaneously or suddenly, and that at the same time it will not do to give all the attention to one and neglect the others. We could give black boys trades, but that alone will not civilize a race of ex-slaves. We might simply increase their knowledge of the world, but this would not necessarily make them wish to use this knowledge honestly. We might seek to strengthen character and purpose, but to what end if this people have nothing to eat or to wear? Wait, Andrea, what are you saying? I'm confused. $1,050,000? Where did I say? 10 million or 5,000 apiece? Is that what you meant? I must have misread something. Is that the case? Well, thank you for correcting me. But okay, we might seek to strengthen character and purpose, but to what end if this people have nothing to eat or wear? A system of education is not one thing, nor does it have a single definite object, nor is it a mere matter of schools. Education is that whole system of human training within and without the schoolhouse walls, which molds and develops men. If then we start out to train an ignorant and unskilled people with a heritage of bad habits, our system of training must set before itself two great aims, the one dealing with knowledge and character, the other part seeking to give the child the technical knowledge necessary for him to earn a living under the present circumstances. These objects are accomplished in part by the opening of the common schools on the one and of the industrial schools on the other, but only in part, for there must also be trained those who are to teach these schools, men and women of knowledge and culture and technical skill who understand modern civilization and have the training and aptitude to impart it to the children under them. There must be teachers and teachers of teachers, and to attempt to establish any sort of system of common and industrial school training without first, and I say first advisedly, without first providing for the hired training of the very best teachers, is simply throwing your money to the winds. Schoolhouses do not teach themselves. Piles of brick and mortar and machinery do not send out men. And when he's saying men with italics, he's not talking about men only, because he has been using it in that inclusive way, because he was saying men and then he brought in the statistics of women involved. So when he's saying men here, he means full humans as opposed to specialists who are good at one thing only, right? Schoolhouses do not teach themselves. Piles of brick and mortar and machinery do not send out full humans, is what he's saying. It is the trained, living human soul, cultivated and strengthened by long study and thought, that breathes the real breath of life into boys and girls and makes them human, whether they be black or white, Greek, Russian, or American. Nothing in these latter days has so dampened the faith of thinking Negroes in recent educational movements as the fact that such movements have been accompanied by ridicule and denouncement and decrying of these very institutions of higher training which made the Negro public school possible and make Negro industrial schools thinkable. It was Fisk, Atlanta, Howard, and Strait, those colleges born of the faith and sacrifice of the abolitionists, that placed in the black schools of the South the 30,000 teachers and more, which some, who depreciate the work of these higher schools, are using to teach their own new experiments. If Hampton, Tuskegee, and the 100 other industrial schools prove in the future to be as successful as they deserve to be, then their success in training black artisans for the South will be due primarily to the white colleges of the North and the black colleges of the South, which trained the teachers who today conduct these institutions. There was a time when the American people believed pretty devoutly that a log of wood with a boy at one end and Mark Hopkins at the other represented the highest ideal of human training. I'm going to copy and paste that reference here into the chat. If Nance or Ann, if you would be able to look that up and just find out what this log of wood thing is about, do let me know. But in these eager days, it would seem that we have changed all that and think it necessary to add a couple of sawmills and a hammer to this outfit and a pinch to dispense with the service of Mark Hopkins. What the heck is this Mark Hopkins guy? I would not deny, or for a moment seem to deny, the paramount necessity of teaching the Negro to work and to work steadily and skillfully, or seem to depreciate to the highest degree the important part industrial schools must play in the accomplishment of these ends. But I do say, and insist upon it, that it is industrialism drunk with its vision of success to imagine that its own work can be accomplished without providing for the training of broadly cultured men and women to teach its own teachers and to teach the teachers of the public schools. This is a beautiful, beautiful tie-in to the course. When we are talking about the rise of the PMC at the turn of the 19th century, as a response to working class militancy, as a part of this movement of progressivism, of Taylorism, of Woodrow Wilson, of the Carnegie Institute, of the Rockefeller Institute, of all of this big progressive money going towards a new vision of society where we're going to have a lot more universities get built, have a lot more people go into the professions, have a lot more specialists coming out and coming into the workplaces and neighborhoods where there's been all of these tensions and strifes, this working class conflict, and now obviously because it had been so heavily racialized as a response to that organizing, as I've talked about elsewhere, this ideal of a sort of subsection of everywhere being sent up for this kind of training and culture, being broadly cultured men and women, this ideal of them being needed by the capitalists, being needed of life without of how industrialism drunk with its vision of success, as he says, only an industrialism drunk with its vision of success would imagine that it doesn't need people who are cultivated, who have like this broader worldview and ability to bring people together, right? And obviously He wouldn't have written it if there wasn't an element of truth there. Obviously, he is responding to the circumstances that he is seeing on the ground. Okay, I have a response from Nance. Let's see. Oh, Anne says, this is what came up when I Googled that. In his 1903 essay, The Talented Tenth, W.E.B. Du Bois opined there was a time when the American people believed pretty devoutly that a log of wood with a boy at one end and Mark Hopkins at the other represented the highest ideal of human training. Nance says, seems to have been just an esteemed academic and theologian, president of Williams College. Oh, okay, that's who Mark Hopkins was. Essentially, the Talented Tenth is saying, look, if we're going to have capitalism, could we at least have a more human kind of capitalism where the talented tenth of every race gets to go to college and then be leaders in their community? Because without that, what's the point of life? Andrea shared that Mark Hopkins was born February 4th, 1802, died June 17th, 1887, was an American educator and Congregationalist theologian, president of Williams College from 1836. Thank you. Hey, from 1836 to 1872. Okay, good to know. So someone that anyone reading this at the time would have known about, probably. But I have already said that human education is not simply a matter of schools. It is much more a matter of family and group life, the training of one's home, of one's daily companions, of one's social class. Now the black boy of the South moves to a black world, a world with its own leaders, its own thoughts, its own ideals. In this world, he gets by far the larger part of his life training, and through the eyes of this dark world, he peers into the veiled world beyond. Who guides and determines the education which he receives in his world? His teachers here are the group leaders of the Negro people, the physicians and clergymen, the trained fathers and mothers, the influential and forceful men about him of all kinds. Here it is, if at all, that the culture of the surrounding world trickles through and is handed on by the graduates of the higher schools. Can such a culture training of group leaders be neglected? Can we afford to ignore it? Do you think that if the leaders of thought among Negroes are not trained and educated thinkers, that they will have no leaders? On the contrary, 100 half-trained demagogues will still hold the places they so largely occupy now, and hundreds of vociferous busybodies will multiply. You have no choice. Either you must help furnish this race from within its own ranks with thoughtful men and trained leadership, or you must suffer the evil consequences of a headless, misguided rabble. His point is, there's no such thing as a group of human beings where there will not be a leader. There will always be leadership. The question is, has that leadership been exposed to great texts and rigorous thinking and discussion with a diversity of ideological views present? Have those leaders been called to task by others in their peer group? Have those leaders cultivated their talents among others who have done likewise? Or are the leaders who rise to the top filling a void that's left from a lack of adequate leadership? And in filling that void, are they not just opportunist demagogues, superstitious pastors is probably who he has in mind the most. Reactionary, backwards fucking pastors and scam artists. That's who he's worried about rising up in the midst of the misguided rabble that has no real head. When he says a headless, misguided rabble, he's not saying there's no leadership. He's saying that that leadership has no real mind that has been cultivated. That's what he's concerned about. I am an earnest advocate of manual training and trade teaching for black boys and for white boys too. I believe that next to the founding of Negro colleges, the most valuable addition to Negro education since the war has been industrial training for black boys. Nevertheless, I insist that the object of all true education is not to make men carpenters, it is to make carpenters men. There are two means of making the carpenter a man, each equally important. The first is to give the group and community in which he works liberally trained teachers and leaders to teach him and his family what life means. The second is to give him sufficient intelligence and technical skill to make him an efficient workman. The first object demands the Negro college and college-bred men, not a quantity of such colleges, but a few of excellent quality. Not too many college-bred men, but enough to leaven the lump, to inspire the masses, to raise the talented tenth to leadership. The second object demands a good system of common schools, well taught, conveniently located, and properly equipped. The Sixth Atlanta Conference truly said in 1901, quote, "We call the attention of the nation to the fact that less than 1 million of the 3 million Negro children of school age are at present regularly attending school, and these attend a session which lasts only a few months. We are today deliberately rearing millions of our citizens in ignorance and at the same time limiting the rights of citizenship by educational qualifications. This is unjust. Half the black youth of the land have no opportunities open to them for learning to read, write, and cipher. In the discussion as to the proper training of Negro children after they leave the public schools, we have forgotten that they are not yet decently provided with public schools. Propositions are beginning to be made in the South to reduce the already meager school facilities of Negroes. We congratulate the South on resisting as much as it has this pressure and on the many millions it has spent on Negro education. But it is only fair to point out that Negro taxes and the Negroes' share of the income from indirect taxes and endowments have fully repaid this expenditure, so that the Negro public school system has not in all probability cost the white taxpayers a single cent since the war. This is not fair. Negro schools should be a public burden, since they are a public benefit. The Negro has a right to demand good common school training at the hands of the states and the nation, since by their fault he is not in a position to pay for this himself." End quote. What is the chief need for the building up of the Negro public school in the South? The Negro race in the South needs teachers today above all else. This is the concurrent testimony of all who know the situation. For the supply of this great demand, two things are needed: institutions of higher education and money for schoolhouses and salaries. It is usually assumed that 100 or more institutions for Negro training are today turning out so many teachers and college-bred men that the race is threatened with an oversupply. This is sheer nonsense. There are today less than 3,000 living Negro college graduates in the United States and less than 1,000 Negroes in college. Moreover, in the 164 schools for Negroes, 95% of their students are doing elementary and secondary work which should be done in the public schools. Over half the remaining 2,157 students are taking high school studies. The mass of so-called normal schools for the Negro are simply doing elementary common school work, or at most high school work, with a little instruction in methods. The Negro colleges and the postgraduate courses at other institutions are the only agencies for the broader and more careful training of teachers. The work of these institutions is hampered for lack of funds. It is getting increasingly difficult to get funds for training teachers in the best modern methods, and yet all over the South, from state superintendents, county officials, city boards, and school principals, comes the wail, "We need teachers!" and teachers must be trained. As the fairest-minded of all white Southerners, Atticus G. Haygood, once said, "The defects of colored teachers are so great as to create an urgent necessity for training better ones." Their excellencies and their successes are sufficient to justify the best hopes of success in the effort and to vindicate the judgment of those who make large investments of money in service, to give the colored students opportunity for thoroughly preparing themselves for the work of teaching children of their people. I would add that though obviously the situation has gotten better for Black people as a whole, because there have been more rights won through civil rights struggles, it's nevertheless the case that the standards of teaching have been lowered for a lot of schools. And so none of my friends who are teachers are super optimistic about the current situation. Of course, we hear the wail, we need funding. We need to stop being overworked. We need to stop having too many students in our classroom. Nobody should have to teach the same class 5 times in a row in the same day, etc., etc., etc. Fair enough. But also, because the university, at least most state universities, have in a lot of cases been lowered to the level of high schools, doing the work of high schools, this achievement of the selection of and cultivation of the best and the refinement and culture of the mind and, putting out into the world like these people who are going to be like these well-rounded and high-cultured, community leaders is in a lot of cases not what's happening. In a lot of cases, what is happening is teachers are at the university because they want to get paid more, right? So the industrial production of the teacher has, in a lot of ways, lost touch with what he wants here. And that is, of course, what the For They Know Not What They Do course. No, that's the course that starts this weekend. But that is what the Idea of the University course is all about. The Idea of the University course just came to its end as far as the live version goes, but there is a version on demand on the Theory Underground website. And in that course, we read The Idea of the University by Carl Jaspers from cover to cover. And I think that he and Jaspers, Du Bois and Jaspers would have gotten along pretty good as far as, this sort of progressive vision for higher education. The truth of this has been strikingly shown in the marked improvement of white teachers in the South. Wait, am I at the right part? The truth of what? Judgment that makes the letters of those give the colored students opportunity for thoroughly preparing themselves for the work of teaching children of their people. I'm going to go just reread that quote from Atticus G. Haygood, who said, "The defects of colored teachers are so great as to create an urgent necessity for training better ones. Their excellencies and their successes are sufficient to justify the best hopes of success in the effort and to vindicate the judgment of those who make large investments of money in service, to give to colored students opportunity for thoroughly preparing themselves for the work of teaching children of their people." End quote. The truth of this has been strikingly shown in the marked improvement of white teachers in the South. 20 years ago, the rank and file of white public school teachers were not as good as the Negro teachers, but they, by scholarships and good salaries, have been encouraged to thorough, normal, and collegiate preparation, while the Negro teachers have been discouraged by starvation wages and the idea that any training will do for a black teacher. If carpenters are needed, it is well and good to train men as carpenters, but to train men as carpenters and then set them to teaching is wasteful and criminal, and to train men as teachers and then refuse them living wages unless they become carpenters is rank nonsense. The United States Commissioner of Education says in his report for 1900, quote, "For comparison between the white and colored enrollment in secondary and higher education, I have added together the enrollment in high schools and secondary schools with the attendance on colleges and universities, not being sure of the actual grade of work done in the colleges and universities. The work done in the secondary schools is reported in such detail in this office that there can be no doubt of its grade." He then makes the following comparisons of persons in every million enrolled in secondary and higher education. So how do I read this table? He then makes the following comparisons of persons in every million enrolled in secondary and higher education. So in 1880, the whole country has 4,362. Whereas Negroes, it's 1,289. Then in 1900, so this is 20 years later, the whole country is 10,743, Negroes 2,061. So it's doubled in the case of Negroes, more than doubled when we're talking about the whole country. And he concludes, while the number in colored high schools and colleges had increased somewhat faster than the population, it had not kept pace with the average of the country, with the whole country, for it had fallen from 30% to 24% of the average quota. Of all colored pupils, 1 in 100 was engaged in secondary and higher work, and that ratio has continued substantially for the past 20 years. If the ratio of colored population in secondary and higher education is to be equal to the average of the whole country, it must be increased to 5 times its present average. And if this be true of the secondary and higher education, it is safe to say that the Negro has not 1/10 of its quota in college studies. How baseless, therefore, is the charge of too much training. We need Negro teachers for the Negro common schools, and we need first-class normal schools and colleges to train them. This is the work of higher Negro education, and it must be done. Further than this, after being provided with group leaders of civilization and a foundation of intelligence in the public schools, the carpenter, in order to be a man, needs technical skill. This calls for trade schools. Now, trade schools are not nearly such simple things as people once thought. The original idea was that the industrial school was to furnish education practically free to those willing to work for it. It was to do things. For example, become a center of productive industry. It was to be partially, if not wholly, self-supporting. And it was to teach trades. Admirable as were some of the ideas underlying this scheme, that's a sort of, he's kind of critiquing Booker T. Washington when he says that. Admirable as were some of the ideas underlying this scheme, the whole thing simply would not work in practice. It was found that if you were to use time and material to teach trades thoroughly, you could not at the same time keep the industries on a commercial basis and make them pay. Okay, point of this is just that we would expect that there would be a way to make trade school pay for itself, right? So let's use carpentry as an example. So you've got to train some carpenters. You would think that training up a lot of different carpenters, you'd be able to produce a bunch of carpentry or products that require carpentry, and then you'd be able to sell those products and pay for, keep the institution running. But as he says here, that did not turn out to be the case. And obviously part of the issue is that industrial growth is fast, and the technologies change, and those are always trying to keep up with the changing industry themselves that are profit driven, right? The what's orchestrating industry is not anything other than the profit motive, right? And so there's always the falling rate of profit, which means that you've always got to intensify labor and lengthen the working day. And so if those pressures are always on the institution, you're not going to be able to focus on the training of those carpenters, right? Many schools started out to do this on a large scale and went into virtual bankruptcy. Moreover, it was found also that it was possible to teach a boy a trade mechanically without giving him the full educative benefit of the process, and vice versa. that there was a distinctive educative value in teaching a boy to use his hands and eyes in carrying out certain physical processes, even though he did not actually learn a trade. It has happened, therefore, in the last decade that a noticeable change has come over the industrial schools. In the first place, the idea of commercially remunerative industry in a school is being pushed rapidly to the background. There are still schools with shops and farms that bring an income, and schools that use student labor partially for the erection of their buildings and the furnishing of equipment. It is coming to be seen, however, in the education of the Negro as clearly as it has been seen in the education of the youths the world over, that it is the boy and not the material product that is the true object of education. Consequently, the object of the industrial school came to be the thorough training of boys regardless of the cost of the training, so long as it was thoroughly well done. Even at this point, however, the difficulties were not surmounted. The first place, modern industry has taken great strides since the war, and the teaching of trades is no longer... Wait, did I say that wrong? In the first place, modern industry has taken great strides since the war, and the teaching of trades is no longer a simple matter. Machinery and long processes of work have greatly changed the work of the carpenter, the ironworker, and the shoemaker. A really efficient workman must today be an intelligent man who has good technical training in addition to thorough common school and perhaps even higher training. To meet this situation, the industrial schools began a further development. They established distinct trade schools for the thorough training of better class artisans, and at the same time, they sought to preserve, for the purposes of general education, such of the simpler processes of elementary trade learning as were best suited therefor. In this differentiation of the trade school and manual training, the best of the industrial schools simply followed the plain trend of the present educational epoch. A prominent educator tells us that in Sweden, quote, in the beginning of the economic conception was generally adopted, and everywhere manual training was looked upon as a means of preparing the children of the common people to earn their living. But gradually, it came to be recognized that manual training has a more elevated purpose, and one, indeed, more useful in the deeper meaning of the term. It came to be considered an educative process for the complete moral, physical, and intellectual development of the child. End quote. Couple things really quick before we keep on with the reading. Just wanted to check in with the audience and say hello to everybody. Woo! We're getting through it. Thank you so much for joining. Once again, it's W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday tomorrow, and I'm also putting up an exegetical reading of a sort of critique of a lot of Black studies, I guess, put forward by Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. And, you know, he likes W.E.B. Du Bois, but he's also very critical of the way that Du Bois has been uncritically inherited, specifically from this period, because, as the title of this video says, I do believe, this is the period in which Du Bois is his most conservative, meaning this idea of class conciliation with the capitalists, his not having he doesn't really have a critique of capital yet. For him, it's just, yeah, people think money is the sole metric of success, and that's stupid. That's kind of his focus. He's focused on racism. The color line is the most important struggle at the time of his writing. But as things progress, later on, he becomes more of a socialist and of a critic of capitalism. And eventually he says that the biggest problem is not just that, there's racism and that there's this sort of leveling effect, and there's a lack of education, and there's a lack of good educators and all of this other stuff. No, the real problem is that comfortable people, wealthy people, privileged people are so content to live in their situations, to live in their wealth at the expense of the immiserated masses, right? And actually, in a sort of sense, you could say that him becoming more socialist leaning also has to do with a sort of disillusionment in the talented 10th to actually do their job. Something that he becomes keenly aware of is that what you get is, at the other side of the university education is not necessarily more moral people, right? People who still have their own vested self-interest and who are not necessarily going to try to raise everybody up, but that are instead quite content to profit at the expense of others, and not just as businessmen, but also in terms of recognition, prestige, and the self-glorified role of spokesperson. So this is essentially a manifesto for a black PMC to exist. Like he wants to help it exist. Of course he does, and rightfully so. But at the same time, as history progresses, he sees that he might have been a little too optimistic. And so what often happens is in critical race theory, there will be a critique of the elitism here, but it doesn't really go the distance. It really doesn't unpack the role of class in the development of W.E.B. Du Bois's thought. So this is very important context in that sense. And so thank you for tuning in, for making this a part of your evening. I would say that you all here must be a part of the talented 10th, or you wouldn't be here. So cheers. Men of America, the problem is plain before you. Here is a race transplanted through the criminal foolishness of your fathers. Wait, am I skipping ahead? I am. No, it's this other paragraph. Thus again, in the manning of trade schools and manual training schools, we are thrown back upon the higher training as its source and chief support. There was a time when any aged and worn-out carpenter could teach in a trade school, but not so today. Indeed, the demand for college-bred men by a school like Tuskegee ought to make Booker T. Washington the firmest friend of higher training. Here he has as helpers the son of a Negro senator, trained in Greek and the humanities, and graduated at Harvard, the son of a Negro, congressman and lawyer, trained in Latin and mathematics, and graduated at Oberlin. He has as his wife a woman who read Virgil and Homer in the same classroom with me. He has a college chaplain, a classical graduate of Atlanta University, as teacher of science, a graduate of Fisk, as teacher of history, a graduate of Smith. Indeed, some 30 of his chief teachers are college graduates, and instead of studying French grammars in the midst of weeds or buying pianos for dirty cabins, they are at Mr. Washington's right hand, helping him in a noble work. And yet one of the effects of Mr. Washington's propaganda has been to throw doubt upon the expediency of such training for Negroes as these persons have had. Damn! Whoa! This whole time I knew he was going to come for Booker T. Washington, because I listened to this when I was working at Amazon last year, when I was working night shift. So, I just listened to the entirety of the Souls of Black Folk in like 2 days' time. And so anyway, I remembered that he comes for Booker T. Washington, but I didn't realize that he barely says anything about him this entire time until this paragraph. And then he's like, bruh, your entire fucking staff is bred out of the university system. And then your propaganda is throwing doubt on the expediency of such training. What the fuck? Men of America, the problem is plain before you. Here is a race transplanted through the criminal foolishness of your fathers. Whether you like it or not, the millions are here, and here they will remain. If you do not lift them up, they will pull you down. Education and work are the levers to uplift a people. Work alone will not do it unless inspired by the right ideals and guided by intelligence. This is the last paragraph, by the way. So, Nance and Anna, if you will have anything that you want to add, we'll just all turn on our mics and kind of just talk for a couple minutes maybe before we go private with the call, which was the original plan in the email that got sent out to the people who are in the PMC Consciousness and Ideology class. So yeah, I'm going to reread this paragraph because this is the resounding close paragraph. This is the power paragraph. And here he really just quilted the entire essay into a fist at the, virtual head of not Booker T. Washington himself, but his propaganda, which is this sort of petty bourgeois, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, segregation is fine, we just have to learn business kind of spokesperson. And kabam! No. Bullshit, he says. Men of America, the problem is plain before you. Here is a race transplanted through the criminal foolishness of your fathers. Whether you like it or not, the millions are here, and here they will remain. If you do not lift them up, they will pull you down. Education and work are the levers to uplift a people. Work alone will not do it unless inspired by the right ideals and guided by intelligence. Education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. The talented tenth of the Negro race must be made leaders of thought and missionaries of culture among their people. No others can do this work, and Negro colleges must train men for it. The Negro race, like all other races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The end. My God. We did it. I will switch the view here to, let's see, let's open up, if you want to turn on your cameras or anything like that, feel welcome to pop on in. I'm going to switch over to the view screen, the Zoom screen here, and turn on my camera over here. Oi, oi, oi. Hi, Ann. So you never read that in high school, huh?
No. Obviously, we learned about like W.E.B. Du Bois, but and if we read anything primary, it would have been like in a textbook, like or a worksheet that was like a few paragraphs. But no, we never got assigned any like real primary text. You are muted.
Oops. What about in college?
College. I think W.E.B. Du Bois was introduced in my like sociology 201 class that was like important sociologists as like the black guy. Like that book had, it was all white guys. And then it was like, oh, we included a woman and a black person. And he was the black person included in the book. So that's where I got a little bit more exposure. But again, it was like primary text that was within the textbook, but everything else was like, just textbook writing.
What a crying shame. Nance, did you ever read W.E.B. Du Bois?
Not in school. Never in school.
Yeah, what is with this discourse where people are like, conservatives are upset that they're teaching this stuff, and it's like, are they? What? Where? I don't know anybody
like where they're teaching, they go, the Civil War, it happened. Here's a test on it. Moving on. I guess now, I graduated from high school, 5 years ago? And so I think now there's a little bit more like, oh, we need to teach about white privilege and modern day racism, but like they're still not actually reading any primary texts about race or class or anything like that in my experience.
Yeah, I would say that like the life and times of Frederick Douglass and the souls of black folk and probably something by Booker T. Washington are probably like the three most important works. Now, I haven't actually read anything by Booker T. Washington. Growing up in a conservative household, it was Booker T. Washington that I heard about. Like he was like the main one. And why? Because it was like a very like pro-capitalist upbringing that was like, you know, Booker T. Washington's he's obviously one of the good ones because here he cares about business, right? He cares about business. He thinks that personal responsibility and turning a profit are probably like the two most important things that anyone can learn. Dylan Baxter in the live chat says, "Bro, we barely read any primary texts whatsoever." I think that that is like the worst thing. I would say he doesn't talk about it here because he takes it for granted. But the talented 10th isn't going to be the talented 10th if it isn't getting its hands on primary texts. If it's not listening to people who've spent their lives reading primary texts talking about primary texts. The idea that people are coming out the other side of a high school, much less a university, without having read primary texts is patently absurd. You cannot get the voice of W.E.B. Du Bois from reading a fucking summary, right? Dylan Baxter said, except for lit. Yeah, literature is the one thing. People do get a firsthand experience of some literature.
Yeah, and I think it's not uncommon to assign like a nonfiction book in an English class. I personally can't recall any like nonfiction books, but yeah, you read like fiction books that you're required to read. Some are really interesting. Some are like the worst books ever written, like Wuthering Heights, and then you move on with your life.
Oddly specific example.
Yeah, I'm started a feud with the teacher, and every day I'd come in and just go, "This is the worst book ever," and then I didn't even read all of it.
Dylan in the
So
chat
yeah,
says,
this is
he says, I got out in 2016, so it's probably worse now. Yeah, it's like if you take a class on philosophy but you didn't actually think with any of the philosophers, I would like you to know you got robbed. If you take a class in Black studies but you're not reading primary text from actual Black voices, you got robbed. You got robbed. It's like you gave them all this money, or they took all this money from people in taxes in the case of like a school or something, right? They got all this money, and then what do they give you? A summary. Usually like in the form of, oh, so that person had a role to play in the evolution of thought. We now believe this. Maybe they contributed to it. Oh, this person had a role to play. They're just kind of like tipping their head. This person had a role to play. But you don't get to think with that person. So you haven't actually gotten introduced to their voice, right?
well, like in my experience, high school isn't, and I guess like college too, but I didn't really take any history classes. Like in all throughout my public education, there's no like real social science or sociology or philosophy. It's all framed in like history. Like any social science that you're getting is history, like the history class. And with that, they don't really teach in like they don't have you thinking about the world in relation to thinkers or ideas or the development of thought or people. It's like events, which is why I always hated history, because it's like I just need to know when this happened, what treaty was and then they throw in the names. Like, obviously, we talk about the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and all the founding fathers and like the documents that they wrote and kind of like that the stuff that we learned in fourth grade um just gets like reiterated in high school. But yeah, that you're being just taught in like events, and it never gets intellectualized, which is probably why history was one of my least favorite subjects, even though I like thrive in social science and sociology, because it's never actually related to the learner or the student. It's just, oh, here's some events that happened long time ago. Like, the reason I think I enjoyed when I was in middle school learning about the Holocaust so much and World War II and like Nazism is because we were actually reading like fiction books about it and talking about it in a lot of different classes and talking about like the ideology of it, not just like, here's an event, it happened in this year, this camp was built. It like, but that doesn't seem to happen very often, sadly.
And your school's progressive. That's a very important point.
Yeah, they were progressive schools in a progressive state, all in like the gifted and IB programs.
Yeah, I'm just that it was kind of while reading this, you know what I mean? I feel like I'm like reading it aloud is different than listening to it in isolation while working in Amazon. It's also different from sitting there and turning the pages in isolation. And so for the live chat or for the live audience, everybody, one of the things that we've been thinking about or having a sort of meta conversation about as we go through the idea of the university course, but also as I start doing more of these exegetical reading sessions in the mornings, is that voice matters and voice comes through. Plato's voice can still come through even when it's translated from Greek into Latin into English, right? It still comes through. It doesn't come through as clearly. There's more noise in a sort of sense. It takes a little bit more work to historically contextualize and make sense of like why he's doing what he's doing and etc. But when it comes to intellect, voice carries through the ages. When great works are read, they continue to speak to us. Now, they don't speak to us the same way. We have to think with them anew. But the vision of education and of textual life that stuck with me profoundly before I had ever really read any nonfiction, when I was just some working plebe at a grocery store stocking shelves for a graveyard shift. Before I went to college, I had never been through any institutionalized education, and I had not, in my homeschooling, actually taken it seriously, and so I hadn't actually read the nonfiction stuff. I just found my ways to bullshit my way through things. I was listening to audiobooks because my friend Chris and we started getting into like self-improvement stuff. And I forget what book it was. Could have been something like Napoleon Hill. Who knows? Something of that vein, probably. Might have been like Wayne Dyer, a little bit more on the new age side of self-help. But he was talking about how one of the ways that you can enrich your life is to, instead of looking at problems that you're dealing with alone, look at it with others. You have to pick your others. You have to kind of put yourself into dialogue with others. And so, of course, you know, this is a sort of hybrid PMC, petty bourgeois, you know, self-help ideology on the part of Wayne Dyer. And so his whole thing is like the power of positive thinking and the law of attraction and, you know, that kind of stuff. But, you know, with that always comes this glorification of Benjamin Franklin. And so obviously from his standpoint, that means that you want to read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and then imagine he's like your mentor. And so like when you're stuck with problems, think what would Benjamin Franklin say? But he does like he goes much further because obviously he's leading like these PMC workshops in Hawaii with Eckhart Tolle, you know, that kind of shit. And so you have all of these like people who make $100,000 to $250,000 a year sitting there on their little yoga mats, and he goes, "Close your eyes. Imagine you're sitting in front of a table, and you have consultants with you, and you've got Benjamin Franklin, and you go down the line, and you've got all these different people." And so it's like a thought experiment where you're supposed to be like, okay, so you've got your week, you've got your problems, you bring your problems to these people who've succeeded, and the point is to read their works and try to use that as something to inform these conversations that you're having with them. And it's funny, it's really funny in a lot of ways, but it's also onto something, because we are multi-voiced bodies. The human subjectivity as a multi-voiced body. It's actually, I'm riffing off of a book here published by some critical theory guy at Duquesne University who wrote a book called The Multi-Voiced Body. And I haven't even fucking read it, but I did hear him give a keynote presentation on the topic. And so the idea is that it's not like you are a distinct human being separated from other distinct human beings, and then we're all like containers filled up with language that is like its own sort of autonomous thing, and then knowledge transfers along lines through communicative networks. No. People's voices affect us, right? One person speaking to everyone else can change the direction of history, right? And so advertising, media, propaganda fills us with voices, okay? And so we walk around and we have ideas pop into our head and we think, that's my own idea. It's not your own idea. You heard it somewhere else and you weren't even paying attention when you heard it. And now it pops up and you think, that's cool. And it feels natural. So it feels like it's your own idea. It's not your own idea. We're full of voices. The job of being a human subject is to filter those voices, to prioritize certain voices, and to choose who we're thinking with. And so in that sense, I would say, if it was Wayne Dyer who was talking about putting Benjamin Franklin at your table, blah, 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 yeah, kinda. That kind of helps clear the rubble a little bit. For me, it's Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Lacan, Baudrillard, W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Adolf Reed Jr., go down the line, all of these people, Olenka Zupančič and Joan Kopchak and Judith Sklar and Hannah Arendt and so many of these other women, Martha Nussbaum, who are fundamental contributions to the life of the mind, interventions in discursive fields that we're all trying to get a stronger sense of or be able to become active participants in, right? And so what I'm trying to say is, to bring it all back around to how annoyed I am, is I feel like there's a sort of intellectual genocide occurring. If the schooling system is pumping people out who never get to actually hear the voices of the greatest minds from the history of our world. And so that other meta conversation that we've been having about how most reading doesn't actually happen in solitude, like for the majority of human history, reading was done in small groups of people who sat there and turned pages and read aloud. And usually the person who's read and reread the text adds a little commentary as you go. The students sit there and transcribe the text, and then they have a separate little book where they add the commentary. And that was education for thousands of years. And so, with the Gutenberg revolution, the explosion of text through the printing press, we now think that it's like this isolated practice, right? It's the Protestant ideal. The Protestant ideal of it's you with the Bible and you just speak to God directly through that or whatever, okay? Well, anyway, I'm just saying I like this. Like, I don't think if this happened tonight, we would have been reading tonight. Or at least I wouldn't have been. And we probably would have done something else and it would have been fine, but we would have probably gone a whole week without the intervention of a great mind speaking, and without that injection of intellect into our lives, we would have been worse off for it. Anyway, so that's my big plug for these exegetical reading sessions and why I'm doing it for the folks who are joining now who are like, what the hell is this? But I wanted to give you both an opportunity to either touch on the exegetical reading stuff and your experience with it so far, or we can tie this back around into the PMC course before we close off the live portion of this session.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something that David said this morning during like a private exegetical reading just through a Zoom call, is that even if you only get 5 minutes of the content, that's, 5 more minutes worth of like a primary text, someone's voice, new information for you to think about. And so in terms of like something that maybe does feel a little bit more dense or doesn't feel, I mean, it's relevant, but maybe it's an older text like what we just read today. It's still like just the fact that we listened to it and maybe we only got 20%, maybe we got 50, maybe we got 80. Like it's more than zero. And I just appreciate like that you do this because it allows me to sit and focus or do the dishes or eat or play Tetris. I'm sure for a lot of people, like all the people who are in the comments, all the people who join these every once in a while, it's just like we're already reading so much more than college students, honestly. And so yeah, just it's really cool what you've got going here, and that we took this opportunity tonight to read something. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the ability to benefit from your labor time and spend time with other people as freakishly obsessed with I don't know, something more meaningful than, like I said earlier, like just scrolling and downvoting everything you see, or just doing any of the million other things that are just a waste of time. It may not be, I don't know. Yeah, it's good. It's productive. I'm grateful.
We're going to say it may not be the same as reading it for myself.
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Because I would have.
I also just, oh yeah,
No,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
I just also wanted to say, kind of back with our like conversation about how, like school K through 12. I mean, really, like first through like 6th grade, we're not expecting kids to be reading W.E.B. Du Bois. Like that's where like teaching history and kind of the timeline is good. But I just think it's really sad that like I don't know what happened in this country where we just like assume that kids can't read this stuff, or like I don't know why the curriculum is so focused not on text and thinkers and thought, because those few times where I did get to like read books or pursue like thought and think for my like actually think for myself and in my own ideas in relation to someone else's, not just like because they teach you critical thinking and different ways to solve a math problem and what is the theme of this piece of literature that we are reading this month. But those like few times where, for example, in my theater program, I read a couple of books by Anthony Artaud, and it's like that's where maybe it's just because I'm a nerd here, like, and I enjoy it, but I just think those are the times when people really like they come alive, and you really just like I think it's enjoyable just in general, not just because we're the type of people who like it. And so it's just sad that throughout most of school, no one actually even is given the opportunity to realize that there is a little bit more than just the like drudgery of learn some facts or regurgitate some things. Yeah, maybe write an original essay about some sociological thinker or something, but it's just not the same. And so it's just a crying shame. Anne Snowgrove for president, 2028. No, I have to wait until probably 2036. And I will reform education, and Nancy's dog will be my mascot.
Oh my
That's a cute
God.
dog.
Oh my God, look at this doggo. Bro, what the hell? What a precious pup. Hey, can you hear me?
I don't think dogs understand screens very well.
No, I don't
Every
think they
time I try
really.
to FaceTime my family's dog at home, he doesn't care at all.
Yeah, they're like, no smell, don't give a fuck.
They're like, nah. But
Yeah,
yeah, that
well,
was just my little. I don't even think I've like been able to articulate like, or I've ever articulated until right now that realization that like what what divides like real passion for education is just like the content and what you're getting the opportunity to do.
so to bring this back around to the PMC course, I want to first ask what questions might have come to mind that were provoked by this text but relate to the course. I mean, obviously there's questions and then there's thoughts that you might have had, you know. One of the questions
I
for,
get well.
oh yeah, oh no, you go.
I was gonna say my like big question is why did you choose this particular piece to be part of the PMC course? I know that's kind of flipped it back on you, but I'm
How,
just curious what you because I feel like that might spark some like my ability to like articulate any question that I have. But yeah,
yeah. Well, thank you for asking. It's a good question. The when we cannot think about the PMC without also thinking about the function of spokespeople or influencers who are supposed to represent demographics. Black people is a demographic, and therefore there are black influencers who put themselves in the position of speaking for the quote unquote race. Okay. So Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. is critical of the role of the black public intellectual in the PMC when not being critical about their position within the PMC, but more importantly, without thinking about the relations between things like race and class, where class gets reduced to just one other vector of oppression and race gets taken to be the more fundamental priority. And obviously that becomes like, you know, a good example of it is, where is Clyburn, whatever his name was, senator, like, for, uh, it's the place where Biden won, and that was kind of like the breaking point with Biden versus Bernie, right? And everyone in the news was saying, well, Bernie basically should have gotten on his knees, and gotten Clyburn on his side, right? But instead, Bernie had Jesse Jackson on his side, right? So this whole game of politicking means courting certain people who are in this position of representative or racial spokesmanship. And so it's something to be thinking. So it's just a part of the broader PMC conversation. But the question after 2020 is like, okay, but what is a black PMC role, function in the reproduction of capital, in the reproduction of race and class relations, right? Like, what are the responsibilities that come with that? And so this is like the manifesto of the Black PMC, and really what we got from Elton's lecture on the first week was when he was reading from the Principles of Scientific Management by Taylor. That text is the manifesto of the PMC broadly. I wonder which piece of writing we might call the manifesto of the feminist PMC, right? But the point is that there's all these different interventions where someone who is an intellectual, who has a big heart and is worried about the future of people, really says, there's this thing with progressivism happening that is mediating between the capitalists and the workers. And it's an important function. And if we don't have our people there, then we're fucked. And so it's strategic. It makes sense. You can't listen to this. You can't listen to me reading him, I don't think, without feeling sympathetic to the plight of black people at the turn of the 19th century, right? So I think that without reading this in its full for you all, it would be too easy to just be like, oh yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote something called The Talented Tenth, and it's basically like saying, people keep thinking that everything good comes from the bottom up, but actually it's the top down. And so we actually need to have the best of the best of the best seclude themselves at higher institutions of learning, and then they'll go back to the people and they'll be the leaders and they will help rise people up, right? And there's good ways of taking that, there's bad ways of taking that, but it's overly simplistic if you don't hear it in its voice, in its full extent. And I think that people who take PMC to be a slur, instead of thinking about it as a socioeconomic, political category and trying to understand its function in the reproduction of society, people who just think of it as a pejorative would probably just think the Talented Tenth is some elitist hogwash. And that is not my position in any way, shape, or form. And if that was somebody's position, I would look at them like they were stupid. I'd be like, what the fuck is your problem? Really? You don't think that you would have written something similar if you were in that position as well, right? And it still speaks to us today. There's still truth in it today. Like I already said, everybody involved in this conversation is, in a way, because of what you're tuning into, because of the fact that you're trying to cultivate the life of the mind, that puts you in that talented 10th. Now, I wouldn't consider myself to be the talented 10th of white people, because I'm not thinking racially primarily. I'm trying to develop myself as somebody who has come from poverty and from a decade in the working class without any nonfiction, went to college, got a little taste of the life of the mind, but it was pretty fucked there as well. And so I'm trying to nurture that, trying to cultivate that, and trying to make something of it, and I can't do that without others, right? And so we're all kind of trying to do this ourselves. And he's right. We can't just spend all of our time in the comment sections of YouTube. We can't just spend all of our time listening to podcasts. We can't just spend all of our time playing video games. We can't just spend all of our times doing the things that he's saying are at the bottom, right? Obviously, we have to survive, and that means that we have to live and be around other people and do what we can. But the point, I think, is that this ought to inspire people to be like, no, we actually do have to cultivate ourselves, and if we don't, we're fucked, right? And so the questions it brings up for me, though, concerning the course, is in what ways is he overly optimistic? In what ways is he structurally naive? In what ways is he not thinking about capital or the history of labor relations up until his time? In what ways does he change as a thinker? In what ways does he become critical of his own standpoint during this phase of his life? And those kinds of questions are going to be a lot more fruitful to be thinking about when approaching a work like Renewing Black Intellectual History, when approaching a work like Dr. Adolph Reed Jr.'s essay that is in there, which Nance was there for one of the private exegetical readings when I read that, and you weren't. And so I think that the question of like the relation of this work to the class is probably it's probably a bigger question for you than it was for Nance, I'm guessing, because Nance sat through like 4 or 5 hours of me reading Read. Is that would you say that it made sense in light of that reading?
I think without that lens, I think, yeah, that very much kind of clarifies, um, and I don't want to say apologizes for, but yeah, makes sense of this.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, to be sympathetic, instead of just, downplaying, dismissing, disavowing, to be sympathetic is a sort of apologetics that we're doing, but we're trying to maintain some critical distance as well. And this is why I think Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. is so adamant on the historical context, right? He cites all of these different people who have this belief that the Souls of Black Folk would have been written today by W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And the point is that there's so many things about it that are historically specific. And one of the big takeaways as well from what we all learned through history is that the college education system gets industrialized. And so this optimistic vision for what is supposed to be made of a person, or how a person is to be made or bred, that's social Darwinist speech, but how a person is the kind of person being qualified by the university, it's not happening. Like we just said, that, or I just came to the conclusion that there's a genocide of voices because people aren't doing primary texts. People are not getting that opportunity to join an actual timeless discourse, because there is a sense in which the life of the mind, we're always rooted in our historicity, in our facticity, in our particularity, in our historical context, yes. But also, you can be in dialogue with all of the greatest thinkers the world has ever known. That's one of the promises of reading, is that you can be in dialogue with them and you can say, I wonder what that person would have thought of this. I mean, they're not here to tell me, but I can look at their situation that they were in. I can try to understand the situation they were in that had them writing what they wrote and think about how the situation's changed. To me, history is pointless if you're not trying to get to know people who were in it, right? And do we want to spend all of our time trying to get to know people whose thoughts were like, No, we want to get to know people whose thoughts were fucking great, who are inspiring us to raise ourselves up to a higher level. And I mean, most of my thoughts are like but that's why I'm trying to associate myself with greater minds, right? Like that's the point of being some working class plebe who's trying to, do something here. And so, yeah. Anyway, everybody on the other side, everyone who's not in this conversation right now, we're going to be closing this out pretty shortly here. And so I'll just say that there will be an exegetical reading of the sort of critique of how the Souls of Black Folk has been inherited by the contemporary PMC. Not just the Black PMC. It's really just the PMC, but also the Black PMC. And I guess the last thing I would say about the Black PMC is the voices that are to be spokespeople of groups, whether there should be spokespersons for groups or not in an ideal society. We live in a real society where groups ultimately need representatives. The question is what kind of people are going to step in to fill the void to lead the masses, okay? And he said it himself. If they're not cultured, if they're not trained up, if they're not well equipped, if they've been purely instrumentalized, the people who take on leadership roles are going to be hacks. I think we are in a situation today where most people who take up leadership roles are hacks. It doesn't matter if they're black, white, gay, or trans. The influencer sphere on the internet is fucking trash. We have some very articulate, very influential people who don't read. And if they read, they're cherry picking to bolster up some ideology that is preconceived because they know that their paychecks come from saying certain things. So the critique of the PMC is a critique of the influencer sphere as well. And Anne and I both come from a city where in 2020, the people who stepped forward to take on leadership roles during the height of BLM activism were using every tactic in their arsenal to get people to pay them direct to their Venmos. It was a clique of 5 people and they were doing that. They were beautiful, articulate, charismatic people who don't have this moral, intellectual, characterological commitment or sense of responsibility. They're fucking hacks. So that's the situation as I see it. And it's not just in that sphere of activism. It's in every sphere of activism that I've encountered. So, you know, people who are very comfortable because they've had their worldview constantly confirmed and they think that they're on the right side of history and they subscribe to all the right Patreons and they share the right tweets, they cannot be convinced that there's a serious systemic problem and that we need to do critical media theory as well as PMC analysis. They cannot be convinced that that is the case. But I can't imagine that a person like that could feel called to do the kind of work that underground theorists feel they have to do. And so at Theory Underground, it's sort of a rite of passage, is coming into an awareness of the historical and structural conditions of the leveling effect, of the hack guru grifter effect, of all of these things that people talk about, algorithmic siloing, blah, 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 ideology, blah, blah, blah. These are all just buzzwords if we don't understand the historical and structural context, right? So that's why it matters to me. Thank you. Salamoon DaCosta said, amen in the chat. Michael, what are you doing awake? Good to see you. Cool. Anything? Actually, you know, Michael's in our Duolingo family. We have a family plan. There's
Wow, the whole fam's almost here.
almost the whole family's here. It's pretty cool.
Or almost the whole family, yeah.
All right. We're gonna go to the private side of the stream. Michael, if you want to hop into the Zoom call with us, I'll actually bring you on. But we're closing out the live side, and so thank you everybody on YouTube who tuned in. We appreciate you. Take care. Much love. I'm going to play an advertisement because I do the exegetical readings at least 3 times a week, or at least that's the goal. And so we want to have more people join us. I have one person messaging me right now asking about the $250 package that gives you access to all of the exegetical readings that have happened and all the ones that will happen for the next year. But also just my $50 patrons get access to the live private sessions that happen at least 3 times a week. So here's the advertisement for that. Take care. Peace. Welcome. What you saw here was a bunch of clips of excerpts from a couple of reading sessions that were done as a part of the Essential Texts live exegetical readings with Dave. Those are not live on YouTube, but they are done live on Zoom. And if you want to be able to participate, we'd love to have you. This is a quick little infomercial about what's being offered. Do you want to read, but you find that you're too distracted? Is that why you find yourself listening to things like this? Do you wish that you could focus in the mornings and have a more structured reading regimen so that you would be able to develop yourself to have a basis
in a variety of fields, from political and social theory to continental philosophy and theory more broadly. Perhaps you find that while trying to do that, what's actually happening is you're constantly getting distracted or getting neurotically caught up in questioning whether you're even reading it correctly or not. And yeah, maybe you could benefit from having morning sessions with me. Every one of the courses being offered from Theory Underground is going to have an accompanied live exegetical reading component that you could attend in the mornings through Zoom calls. If you're someone who either has a lot of time on their hands and is playing video games, working out, skateboarding, or perhaps doing some kind of wage labor that allows you to listen to things, this is an opportunity to basically read these texts, but with a guide. Someone who's already been over the territory before. This can drastically accelerate your own development, but also your own reading habits. Essential Texts with Dave in the Morning is something that I've been planning and developing for a while now, but I've only been doing it for a few weeks, and it's been a really good time. It's one of those things where I stop and have a side conversation to make sure that we've been making sense of the text up until that point, and then I'll summarize where we're at and then keep going. And that kind of interaction with other people while reading a text aloud takes it out of the isolation and sort of self-referentiality and confusion of just doing things by yourself sometimes, especially if you are newer to texts like these. So I will be reading a variety of texts from political and social theory, as well as stuff like fundamental ontology with Martin Heidegger and Levinas and Das Kapital by Marx. So there's going to be a lot of different texts, kind of depending on what it is that we are doing in the courses. You don't have to sign up for the course to get access to Essential Texts with Dave. All you have to do is become a 1/10 of the cost of the means of production for Theory Underground patron, or a $50 a month patron. Either of those two tiers of patronage will get you access to the live exegetical readings of Essential Texts with me. On the other side, if you're not able to join these conversations live, you can pay for the backlog of all of my live exegetical readings, which are not publicly accessible. This video that you saw here was only the tip of the iceberg.